Any better?
It's hot, even when it's out. Make sure your child doesn't start November the 6th.
Picture this. The year is 1960. The Beatles are playing on the radio, miniskirts are in, and the scent of freedom and rebellion is in the air. It was a period in which people evolved, inspiration grew, and the conventional way of doing things was questioned. However, there were some things produced during the time that have been banned from today's world. Let's have a quick ride in a time machine to the 1960s and discover trendy things that have died down today.
Now, Planters peanut butter is better. Better than the leading peanut butter.
Availability of peanut products in schools. Sometime in the past, if you asked any child what they had in their lunchbox, there was a 90% chance they would mention a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It was a common staple in school lunches during breaks. It was the go-to choice for children not only because of how cheap that it was, but because it was a quick way to add protein to your diet. At that time, not a lot of people had realized peanuts as an allergen, and when it was discovered, it was a major source of allergic reactions. With the rise of children with peanut allergies, peanut-based products became more and more scarce in the market, and schools completely restricted it from their lunch to prevent any allergic incidents. As of now, only 1.8% of the population has an allergy to peanuts. It was a hard choice to make, but eventually it was decided it was better to sacrifice the protein option than to risk the lives of students. Mercury in a glass thermometer. Amongst the many options, mercury in glass thermometers were common in the 1960s because it expanded greatly when heated. The slightest change in temperature usually was noticeable when using a mercury thermometer. Back then, mercury thermometers were a special tool found in many hospitals and used to illustrate change in temperature in schools. But everyone who used or owned one knew how important it was to keep them extremely safe because they could be a big problem if they broke. It was also the perfect choice for home thermometers until health and environmental concerns arose. Exposure to high levels of metallic vapors were discovered to cause permanent damage to the brain, kidneys, and even to a developing fetus. And more so, increased exposure of mercury to the environment resulted from improper disposal of broken thermometers that would end up flowing back into water bodies and contaminate the fish. Eventually, other options like digital thermometers, alcohol and gas, and strip thermometers became much more preferred, leading to the mercury in glass going obsolete. Silicone breast implants. Breast implants were invented in the 1960s and became a trendy thing soon after. For many people, having implants was a symbol of beauty, and back then it was a trend for women to look for ways to get a prettier body shape that accentuated most of their feminine features. The goal was to look like a Barbie doll, but with really big boobs and back. It was popularly called the figure eight. Getting this body shape was some people's biggest achievement or goal. That is, until problems began. Implants ruptured, causing them to leak and even explode. More and more people became aware of the threats that implants imposed on people's health. Although breast implants are still in use today, there are much more strict regulations around getting them. For example, it's a must that any surgeon who does one must be certified, and they can only use certified silicone materials. Unregulated fireworks. A fireworks display is one that people around the world look forward to and tag as a majestic sight. Historically, different states celebrated special days with fireworks, and they lit up the sky and gave everyone a wonderful time. The only downside was that same day, or sometimes the next, there were children and adults at the doctors or in hospitals from burn wounds and accidents with fireworks. These injuries ranged from minor to severe, and sometimes a firework could land somewhere and cause damage or start a fire. This led to strict restrictions being placed on fireworks in the 1980s, and in recent times, unless you have a permit, you can't actually purchase them. These days, most displays are organized and licensed during New Year celebrations or some other national event. Polychlorinated biphenyls. Polychlorinated biphenyls were used widely in electrical equipment like capacitors and transformers, along with hydraulic fluids, heat transfer fluids, lubricants, and plasticizers. They're man-made chemicals that were common in the 60s until production was stopped in 1977. The main reason it was stopped was due to improper disposal of these equipment that was made with PCBs. They were usually improperly dumped, which ultimately led to an environmental exposure, and it was discovered that high exposure to PCBs caused birth defects, developmental delays, liver issues, and many other risks. Everyone knew to avoid it then. New versions of equipment formerly made with PCBs were later developed. However, it's possible to have equipment that still contains them at home, especially if it was manufactured before 1977. Littering. Imagine you're walking down the street and you notice another person walking ahead of you dropping pieces of garbage. You might raise an eyebrow, and even if you don't walk up to him to try and stop him, it's either somebody else does or an officer gives him a fine for littering. It's like this now, but things were rather different in the 60s. Regulations and laws against littering were much less strict and less enforced. Many places didn't have good public trash collection and recycling programs like we have today, so if somebody had dropped trash in the park, they were most likely not at fault because it was possible the park didn't even have a trash can. It could be compared to now when you can't even go for a walk without seeing ads somewhere about the dangers of littering. There wasn't so much of public messaging and education about littering then, and there were fewer laws and repercussions for littering. That left streets and even the oceans full of garbage. The environmental dangers that resulted from littering increased, so eventually something was done about it, and the various laws and regulations were put into place.
How about Laborit? Has a real refreshing mouth purifier and love.
Unrestricted pharmaceutical advertising. In the 1960s and even years before that, it was common for pharmaceutical companies to put drugs on display without proper oversight and control. This, of course, gave room for fake or unlicensed drugs and products to be sold and advertised. After a lot of these began taking people to the hospital rather than out of them, something had to be done. We now have strict FDA rules that stop pharmaceutical companies from advertising and selling unlicensed products, and non-compliance attracts harsh consequences. In the 1960s, a company could make really bold claims about their product without fear, whether it was proven or not. It was possible to find a proverbial snake oil salesman selling tonics from the back of a wagon, but gone are those days. These days, people are smarter, and the rules are a lot more strict. Lawn darts. Also sold under the name of jarts, these items were 12 inches long with a heavy tip made out of metal on one end and decorative plastic fins at the other. The metal tips were blunt so they wouldn't cut the hands of the person tossing them, but remained pointy and heavy enough to stick in the ground when they were thrown. The sharp-pointed toys were many times used in backyards despite being hazardous. You could commonly find them in the toy section and sold to children until complaints began dropping in from parents who believed it was better suited for the sporting sector and not as toys. Despite being taken off the kids sector, it still didn't reduce the number of injuries and was eventually completely banned from stores.
Did you know in nearly half the states, teachers are permitted to hit their students?
Corporal punishment in schools. In recent times, a teacher could be jailed for using physical punishment on a student, but that wasn't the case back in the 60s. If a student did something wrong and was discovered, such a student could expect a slap over the hand or the smack on the butt with a wooden ruler or worse. There were different disciplinary measures used to make students comply. That's quite different from the approach in recent times where teachers are not even allowed to touch a student or use any kind of physical punishment. Now, instead of a slap on the wrist, a naughty student will be made to visit the principal's office and get an after-school detention or perhaps just asked to clean the hall. Unsafe playground equipment. These days, visiting the park isn't a nightmare. Many parents used to dread taking their children to the playground because there was a 70% chance the child would return with an injury. In the 1960s, playground equipment was made out of metal, and some of these playgrounds had hard concrete floors. The metal equipment would often get damaged or rust, which would lead to sharp and pointy edges, and even the safer ones malfunction, leaving children with injuries. Older versions of playground equipment could be made out of heavy materials and were difficult for children to play with. Eventually, these metallic and unsafe equipment were banned, and equipment began being made from plastics or other safer materials, and playgrounds became more child-friendly, while also being more safe and colorful for children to play with.
Any attempt to restrict drinking and driving here is viewed by some as downright undemocratic.
Open alcohol containers in cars. There was once a time when driving with an open alcoholic drink right beside you wasn't that big of a deal. In fact, one popular image that portrayed youthful exuberance was a guy with dark shades and a bottle of booze beside him in the car. Even if you got pulled over by police with an open container, you wouldn't get so much as a stern look because it wasn't a big deal. Things have become so much different since the open container rule in 1998. Now, having an open alcoholic beverage within reach of the driver has become an act that's punishable by law. This was done to curb drunk driving, and while you may have gone scot-free in the 1960s, you might now find yourself taking your next drink after serving time for the offense. No child car seats. Putting a child in a car without a seat is considered one of the most dangerous things to do in recent years. We rely on car seats to keep our little ones safe during our daily adventures or a long road trip, but that's not always been the case. In fact, the initial purpose of manufacturing car seats for children was not because there were worries about the child's safety, but instead to ensure the child wouldn't be able to move and distract the driver. Parents would often hold their children on their laps and use regular household items to create makeshift restraints, or they may just allow them to sit freely on the back or front seat. Later, the entire system of traveling with a child developed and rules were enforced to ensure the child's safety. Today, driving a child without a car seat could lead to being stopped by the police and given a fine, and sometimes cases could even spiral to the point of getting child protection services involved.
Researchers wanted to prove the effectiveness of seat belts under actual conditions.
No seat belts in cars. Things were done rather differently before car seats became the norm. During those times, a lot of other things were done wrong and had not been addressed, like people driving at whatever speed they found convenient without proper safety precautions. Car seat belts didn't become a thing until the 1970s, after which they were proven to lower the risk of injury while driving. Prior to then, people couldn't care less about whether they had their seatbelts on. In the modern day, it's both legally required and a manufacturing standard for vehicles to be equipped with seatbelts. After all, seatbelts save lives, and the number of crash fatalities greatly reduced since the three-point belt was invented in 1959. While a driver today would get a fine for not using a belt, it was nowhere near being an offense back in the 1960s.
The balance of nature is built of a series of interrelationship.
DDT pesticide. Pest invasion is something that's always bothered people. Humans have been interested in getting rid of invasive bugs. Back in the 1960s, if you needed the most effective way to get rid of insects and pests, DDT was the way to go. After using it in World War II, it then went on to become the perfect weapon for farmers to use on their farms against pests. It was obviously harmful to insects and effective in getting rid of them, but it also showed no immediate issues or risks to humans at the time. It's fair to say it was the magic of the season, which begs the question, why was it then banned? Its ban simply explained the fact that nothing is perfect after all. After further research due to health complications, DDT was shown to have adverse effects on people. A very large percentage of the chemical was discovered in their body composition, and health concerns were too adverse to be ignored.
The silk-like fibers that grew in the cracks were the material from which asbestos was made.
Asbestos use. Asbestos was tagged as a wonder material in construction and house building and was used for different building purposes. It was particularly popular during the 1960s and 70s, although it was also used extensively before this. Even now, it's still found in many places and flats that were built during those times. A lot of people chose it because it was easy to find, it was cheap, and the mineral was resistant to fire, electricity, and chemical corrosion. More and more people used it in public buildings and system-built flats until they realized it was a carcinogenic substance and exposure could cause illness like mesothelioma. Its use in construction was eventually banned. Pets roamed freely. One thing that you may have noticed if you were to go back to the 60s is that everyone let their dogs out. Animal control wasn't a popular thing, so a typical neighborhood could have lots of stray dogs and cats. These all slowly ended for one major reason: animal violence. It became common to hear about pets, children, and sometimes adults becoming attacked by stray animals, and led to the introduction of the Dangerous Dogs Act in 1991, which placed restrictions on certain dog breeds and made owners responsible for their pets' behavior in public. Many pet owners became more vigilant about keeping their dogs under control, since they could be held responsible for any form of public ill action that their pets exhibited. The awareness about public safety concerns increased as loose dogs and cats posed risks to pedestrians, cyclists, and other animals. Campaigns encouraged responsible dog ownership and keeping dogs on a leash in public. Compared to the 1960s, when dogs lived in their own little world inside of our big world without constraints, it's now become a social norm and legal requirement for dog owners to keep their pets under close control when in a public space.
Just had a couple of beers. Proven breath test indicates that your breath contains alcohol. There's one other thing, I'm not sure whether you're aware, the young fella has in fact died.
Drunk driving with minimal consequences. Back when the legal blood alcohol content limit was often 0.15% or higher, it was more socially acceptable and legally permissive to drink and drive compared to today's standards. Today, the legal limit is a maximum of 0.08. When the laws against drunk driving in the United States were passed in 1910, there was still a loophole that was obvious in the law. They simply prohibited driving while intoxicated, without there being a set definition of what level of drunkenness qualified as drunk driving. So anyone could drink while driving, as long as they could prove that they weren't drunk. Unlike now, something as little as having an open container in your car while driving is enough reason to go to jail.
Since Honda invented the three-wheel all-terrain cycle, people have found it real handy for lots of chores.
The three-wheeler ATV. ATVs were originally targeted towards sportsmen and became multi-purpose machines serving both recreational and utility purposes in the 1960s, especially after customers began purchasing them as utility vehicles for agriculture and farming purposes. Their reasons for using these three-wheeler ATVs instead were that they cost far less than a tractor and they only used 8% of the fuel needed. However, the new rave led to an increase in accidents and injuries, mostly amongst adolescents and children. Based on an article in 1988, 7,000 people were being injured in ATV accidents each and every month, and shortly after the production of three-wheeled vehicles came to an end due to safety concerns. Knowing how much adrenaline driving a three-wheeler ATV could come with, it's safe to say it's better left off in the past. A rebirth of this in the world of adrenaline junkies would definitely lead to many accidents and casualties.
Union 76 Super, one of the best leaded premiums around. Now, still want to sell that car cheap?
Cheap? They don't make them like this anymore.
Lead in paint and gasoline. The addition of lead to gasoline begins as far back as the 1920s. The anti-knock agent, which improved the efficiency of vehicles and the performance of the engine. It turned clunky engines into smoothly running and generally improved their performance. However, what seemed to be the perfect remedy for clunky engines was in fact a wrong choice, because lead is a toxic pollutant and using it in gasoline leads to a pollution of the air when the fumes are released into the atmosphere. This resulted in some major health issues like lead poisoning and was also linked to poor cognitive performance in children. Other alternatives for lead were discovered, and due to its impact on the population's health, usage of lead in paint and gasoline would be banned. What are your thoughts on these banned items? Be sure to let us know in the comments below. And if you like this video, you'll also want to see this one about things in the 1960s we can no longer do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.